Bienvenidos a todos. This is the Paseo podcast. It is February 19th, but that doesn't really matter because it's a podcast. So if you're listening to this or watching this on YouTube, we really appreciate you being here, watching us, listening to us, wherever, whenever you are. We have a couple of special guests today. No strangers to the Paseo podcast. We have with us Illinois State Senator Cristina Pacione-Zayas and Managing Director of Core Member Leadership for Teach for America, Jason Dones. Cristina, Jason, how are you today? Welcome to the Paseo podcast.
Super excited to be here. How are you?
Living the dream.
Same, excited to be here.
Super happy to have you both on. For people listening, we're not going to do the deep dive into who these two guests are. If you want, listen back to previous episodes. We actually had Cristina on to talk about her work in early childhood education at the Erickson Institute. Obviously, by the way I introduced her on this podcast, a lot has changed since then. So we'll go into her new title and her new role. Jason's last episode was much less
very
serious.
Different circumstances.
Much less serious than what we're going to talk about today. We were talking about Jennifer Lopez's performance at the Super Bowl. So,
oh my God.
Important in different ways.
Amen. So it's a little bit of a 180. But today we're actually going to talk about the culturally responsive teaching and leading standards that the Illinois State Board of Education is trying to adopt statewide. There's been a little bit of quote unquote controversy. There was an attempt by the GOP here at the state level to block those standards from being adopted. Luckily, that was not the case. Cristina and Jason both have a close understanding and have worked in some capacity with the development and review of these standards. So really excited to take the deep dive on these standards with you both today. But before we get into the nitty gritty of all that, would just love for either of you, again, people can listen to old episodes to learn more about you, but State Senator, why don't we start with you? What should our audience know about you?
Well, I am 60 days into this position, representing the 20th Legislative District, which comprises 8 communities on the Northwest side. So Albany Park, Avondale, Belmont Cragen, Humboldt Park, Hermosa, Logan Square, Old Irving, and Portage Park. Very diverse community, majority Latino, but we also have a sizable Polish, Asian, Native American, Middle Eastern populations, and really excited to transform and kind of translate my experiences and skills in this particular position. I've done a lot of work, obviously, on the ground in community and organizing and education. And I'm looking to really take those experiences and open up avenues for the government to really be of the people, by the people, and center our lived experiences in the policies that we make.
Jason, what should our audience know about you? Also, after you give your intro, can you also talk a little bit about Teach for America for anybody listening that's not familiar with the organization?
For sure. So, yes, my name is Jason Dones. I am a Chicago native, Humboldt Park native. I'm still here, living on the boulevard, living it up. I currently serve as the Managing Director of Core Member Leadership at an organization called Teach for America. I'll come back to like kind of who we are in a second, but I was also a member of the task force that was brought together by ISB to draft these standards. So a collection of educators and stakeholders who, including students, which I don't think everyone really knows, but who came together to just offer up the wealth of knowledge we have gathered over the past, over the course of our careers, and kind of determine what's next for education in our state by way of being culturally responsive. Why was I part of that? So I'm a culturally responsive teaching specialist. It's kind of, since I entered the nonprofit world, since I was teaching, it was kind of the thing that really invited me into the profession. And so I hope to just bring whatever expertise I can offer and dive into this with you all today. Teach for America is a national organization, a nonprofit leadership development organization. Our primary battleground, so to speak, our primary like lane of influence and change is education. And so we gather at different regions throughout the nation. Traditionally young people, though people of all types, a diverse core of leaders who are just ready to make a difference and are realizing for a variety of reasons that education is the pathway to doing that. And so we bring them in, we train and develop them to be hopefully excellent novice educators. And equally important, make sure that they're committed to this movement long term. So whether they stay in the classroom, which about half of our people do, or they transition to different roles in the movement, different ways to contribute, that they fundamentally care about equity, justice in education. So that's a little bit about us. I work in the teacher development sphere, but that's kind of the lens I'm bringing today.
Really excited to dive into the culturally responsive teaching and leading standards. But I realized the last time we had you both on, we did not ask this question, and we started asking this question to all of our guests when we came back from break over the summer. I'm just curious to hear from both of y'all. State Senator, let's start with you. What part of Puerto Rico is your family from?
My father is from Cuamo, which is kind of south central-ish, not far off from Ponce. And my husband's family, because I got a claim as well. We've got the whole island covered. His family is from Humacao, and his father's from Humacao, and his mom is from Añasco. So we've got East Coast, West Coast.
You do got the island covered.
Got it.
My gosh, that's awesome. Jason, what about your roots on the island? Where's your family from?
Yes, San Lorenzo is the town our family hails from. It's kind of centrally located. If you're going from San Juan to Ponce, you run into kind of a beautiful mountain region and small town. Home to one of my favorite, unexpectedly, donuts in the world. It was at this random shop. So yeah, San Lorenzo is the place my family's from.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever had a Puerto Rican donut. I mean, I guess at a panaderia, but I don't think I've ever had a donut from Puerto
There's
Rico.
one in that hometown that.
Okay, shoot dang. All right, noted.
Right.
Okay, y'all.
Visit.
Yeah.
Write it down. Write it down.
Putting it in the itinerary. My goodness. Okay, cool. So let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about these culturally responsive teaching and leading standards. State Senator, can you give us a little breakdown for people just hearing about them for the first time listening to this, or people looking for a bit more understanding of what exactly they are? What are the culturally responsive teaching and leading standards?
Okay, so I'm so glad you're starting with that question, because if people have been following, the media kind of blitz against it, there's been a lot of misinformation. And so these are standards that are meant to instruct and inform teacher education programs at the university level. So when you have individuals who are pursuing what we call a PEL, or a professional educator license, the accredited institutions that grant those licenses, whether they be through a bachelor's program or a master's program, have to be designed to be aligned with these particular standards. So generically, that's what it is. But then the content is really what makes it very different and distinct from the past. And, as Jason had mentioned, his entree to the field is culturally responsive practice and pedagogy. And that has been, developed over the course of several decades, in the field of education, under the premise that as educators, one, children and young people don't come to us as blank slates. They come to us with a wealth of assets and experiences. And it's our job as educators to partner with them, their families, their community, to really explore the world together, to co-create knowledge, to affirm identities, to be inclusive, to support the development of their advocacy, their voice, and to be self-reflective as educators and the power dynamics that we typically kind of hold and how the institution of schooling has been, as well as exploring systems of oppression and what are the ways that we can disrupt and transform that through the educational practice, through the relationships that we hold, through the content that we explore. So I'll stop right there because that's just kind of the overall picture of what these standards are.
There was this vote to block it, with that effort kind of quashed. So they weren't blocked, so they're moving forward. For people that aren't familiar with the legislative process, Senator, if we could stay with you for a second on this one, what does this mean now? What's the next step for CRTL?
Okay, so they're actually created through what we call a rule-making process, right? So there is our school code, which governs all the various aspects of the educational system, right? From learning standards, to curricula, to teacher preparation, to teacher evaluation and assessments, right? So if this is the teacher preparation arm in the school code, there was a set of directives about, what teacher education programs should have. And what this has done has now shifted that language to reflect the process that Jason was a part of over the past 2 to 3 years. And so how this works is that the State Board of Education convened a task force that Jason participated in, along with many educators and experts in the field and students. And over the course of, their kind of investigation, and actually, I think Jason should talk about that a little bit more. I won't go there, but the point is at some point, the task force presents some recommended changes to the State Board of Education. State Board of Education reviews those changes, perhaps gives some feedback, and then those, once the changes have been adopted, the board approves it and it goes to JCAR, which is the Joint Committee on Administrative Rulemaking. And so this is a committee that's impaneled it's bicameral, so you have General Assembly members from the House of Representatives, General Assembly members from the Senate. It's also bipartisan. And this is a committee where you have 6 from each chamber and 6 from each political party. And so they review the rules. There's a public comment period where the public can weigh in and submit their comments. That gets reviewed. It may alter some of the language, but ultimately in the end, it is the members of JCAR that vote on this to make the official rule change. And it becomes, if it's in the language of the rules, it becomes effective immediately, or there might be a little bit of a runway for it to become effective.
Okay, super.
And just also too, on a, government education tip, there's legislation, statute, and then there are rules. And usually, rules you have to be kind of careful with, because those rules can be changed at a certain point in time. Whereas if you pass it and you codify it in legislation, that's a much harder process to undo. So sometimes we make policy changes through legislation, and sometimes we make it through the rule-making process.
So does that mean if these get through the rulemaking process, there could be the potential for years down the line, a new governor in office, a different majority in the state Congress, that these standards could then be altered?
That is my understanding. And the reason why I say that is because we just went through the process. There's a kindergarten individual development survey that's administered 40 days after the first day of school for kindergartners. And that was a rule-making process. But what we did in the lame duck session is we actually codified it in law. so that that can't be changed. It is now even protected further. And so I believe that is the case here, is that these are just rules at this point. Obviously, they have to be implemented. There's an implementation date, so on and so forth. But I believe if we really want to go the step further, we'll want to, go through a legislative process to codify it.
And in terms of timeline, and I know this things are hard to predict, but in terms of timeline from these standards being officially adopted statewide, what does that look like? Are we talking about a year till we see that? Months? Can you give us a sense of time frame?
If it's a new teacher education program that is looking for approval from the State Board of Education, they basically, as of October 1st, 2021, they'll have to, present that program under these particular rules. If you're an existing teacher prep program, you have until October 1st, 2025 to be in alignment with these standards.
Gotcha. Okay, that's super helpful. Jumping around a little bit here, but Jason, you mentioned in a Sun-Times piece that you recently wrote, and we'll of course put that in the show notes so everybody can give that a read. And Cristina mentioned it earlier too, that you were a member of the network of educators and stakeholders who really came together to draft CRTL standards. Can you give us a little insight? Walk us through what that process was like from the beginning conversations all the way to the final draft?
Yeah, for sure. It is a long process, as Cristina named. Like it's years in a process. And a lot of hard work. And I think a thing that got kind of silenced in the story with this misinformation campaign was that just how deliberate that process was, including a diverse set of stakeholders. Again, from policymakers in rural communities I know nothing about. Like, I learned so much because I'm such a Chicago homebody from rural superintendents, like people I would never get the opportunity to interact with, just about how the dynamic racially and culturally is different in like a rural environment, to current educators, to students. Essentially it was, we're in a room together, first building kind of alignment and knowledge. Like what are we after? Like we all know we have different kind of different access points or levels of expertise. All of these levels were high, but like kind of different entry points to this work. What are we after together? And what contextually do we need to understand about this mission? So it was a lot of first just rallying around what we're after, while simultaneously getting to know each other better, right? Because the team that's going to design a standards to be culturally responsive across the state needs to operate in a culturally responsive way. We needed to better understand each other, or each other's mission, each other's vision. And so it was kind of like simultaneous, like rolling up our sleeves and starting to theorize alongside just kind of like building connections that would have otherwise not happened. And we organized by the ISB team in support, with the support of a consultant group who are experts in the field. We essentially just were kind of in this constant cycle of build knowledge, set intention, draft up, using the wealth of knowledge that we have available to us, like the set of commitments, first at like the highest level, and then like turn that into teacher level actions, and just like go through cycles of drafting. And again, a thing that was lost, I think, in the story is the idea that, nothing really reached paper until it had a lot of eyes on it and a lot of expertise and a lot of heart put into it. And this like kind of idea that there was some concerted like leftist idea or like scheme to push something forward. I'm gonna tell you, from being a person in the room, I didn't experience that. There was no scheme other than trying to better define what school can be in our state, primarily for Black and brown students, but also for white rural students who are not necessarily the majority when you think about public school students across the nation, to gay students who face different levels of bias and prejudice in their schools, oftentimes unintentionally, right? So it was this to go back to the process, like just this constant cycle of just what do we believe needs to be true to make schooling more culture responsive? How can we translate that into orientations at a teacher's level, like what someone has to believe about students, actions at a teacher level, like what someone actually brings to a classroom, and then student outcomes, what actually students then demonstrate that showcases their school environment is more culture responsive. And we just like dug in for months and months and months and months until we essentially, this is the last thing part I'll share, we were kind of organized into sub teams based off of like expertise. So once we kind of got, like, we set the stage, we were organized into sub teams around like our lane of just expertise to really define more deeply that one section of the standards together. And then we presented them across sub teams to get ratified. That cyclical process took us to kind of that endpoint where ISB was like, all right, we're going to take this to like our drafting team, make it more official, and then start the process of getting this proposed. So yeah, it really was, it was just like this, the thing I hope people realize is how intentional and collaborative the process was, because this is serious work. It's not something we're just gonna, half-heartedly put together.
Yeah, no, well said. I'm glad you brought up that point about, kind of the critique against these standards being adopted. And I do want to ask y'all some of these about some of these critiques that I've read about, just to get your thoughts. But one point you mentioned was really interesting. And just to clear up for people listening, if you've read that these standards are some type of left-leaning, initiative, propaganda, whatever you want to call it, it was not in a progressive Illuminati that was behind this.
We are the progressive Illuminati.
Yeah, right. There will be people that will take that clip. And,
Edit that out.
We're gonna cut that. But shifting gears a little bit, I just kind of the flip side, just thinking about the collaborative nature of making sure these standards get to where they are today. State Senator, you had actually written in the Chicago Tribune that you were the secretary of the Illinois State Board of Education at the time when the CRTL standards were adopted by the Illinois State Board of Education. Can you give us a little bit of insight into what that ISB adoption process was like? What was kind of the criteria the board was looking for when adopting these standards?
So, the start of the process predated my time on the board, because the task force was formed in 2018. It predated, actually, I want to say, almost everyone on the board, including the superintendent, except for one person. There was one holdover from the previous administration. And so we were brought up to speed on this a couple months before we actually adopted them. There was a presentation made to the board, and how, just again, a little bit of education on process, right? So before every single board meeting, we get a board packet, but there's also a couple of committees that meet prior to the full board meeting. One of those committees is the Educational Policy Planning Committee. And usually a lot of the substantive information that ends up getting on the agenda for the full board meeting kind of gets vetted through that subcommittee, right? And so that committee got a chance to kind of have a little bit of a discussion of these rules or these standards that were being developed before we had I think we had a full presentation, and then there was like the public comment period. And it was interesting because we had some members that happened to populate that subcommittee that were raising the very critiques that a lot of the opposition was raising. A lot of this language around, is this political? This is going too far. What is really the intent? And it was, I would listen in on those meetings because I wasn't a member of that committee, and I could speak if I wanted to, but I thought it was interesting just to kind of like let that conversation ride. And the reason why is because I had always, since I was day one on the board, disrupting, really presenting in some ways radically different perspectives than what most people around that table were comfortable with, or versed in. And so it was the first time I started to hear those kinds of rumblings. So when we had the full presentation, some members of the committee were present, as well as some of the experts that were also brought in from other institutions and entities that have adopted similar standards. And, we had a really robust discussion about process. And we also had discussion about content. And then we ultimately all voted to approve so that it can go through the JCAR process. And so my understanding is that when one of the public comment periods revealed a lot of this opposition, there then started to be a little bit of negotiation with respect to some words. And there were 2 words that were actually changed from the original drafting. One of the words was activism, because there's an element in there that talks about supporting student feedback and advocacy. So they changed activism to advocacy to kind of quell some of the concerns about what people were perceiving as politically charged words. The other word that was a big change was progressive to inclusive. And so it was interesting because I was actually one of the board members that vocalized that I thought actually they should have kept those words, because I didn't want it to get watered down. I really thought that the intent, again, was to disrupt the manifestation of white supremacy within our educational system and how it shows up over and over and over again in covert and overt ways. And if we really want to address it, you have to be very precise in how you name the solutions and how you name the problems. And so I actually was on the record saying, like, I was good with progressive and activism. Like, I don't really have a problem with that. But apparently, some people were very uncomfortable with it, and it was a constant negotiation.
Interesting. Yeah, it sounds a little bit of splitting hairs there.
Right.
Difference between activism and advocacy.
Let's value the spirit of it, right? Like, I get we're in like a politicized time. In many ways, we've never left a politicized time, but it's branching into everything, and it was honestly sad for me to see this get over politicized. We're talking about the support of students that we serve, right. And the spirit of some of the kind of founding thinkers of this field, one of the themes is that your school should be responsible to encouraging students to essentially take ownership over their lives. And in many ways, there's an activism component. There's change, but it's not the change that's defined by the teacher. It's the change that's defined by the student. That the teacher's responsibility is ultimately to give students the space to motivate the change that they seek, regardless, like whatever that is. It could be what we deem really left and progressive. It could be the opposite, but it's that they have that power and they've been given that agency. So to see us, like, to your point, like splitting hairs, and fearing the, spirit of what it means to be culturally responsive. I get it, and it's frustrating.
Yeah. And if I can add, I mean, I think, in my kind of formal education, and particularly in the grad experience, I was a student of critical race theory, 20 years ago. So well before it landed in the former, administration's mouth in that executive order where he literally named it as something that cannot happen in federally funded trainings and programs and so on and so forth. And I think one of the biggest things I learned, and this was actually in undergrad, is that it's not about politics. Schooling isn't necessarily one. We need to disrupt the notion that schooling is apolitical, because it is political. And it's all about whose politics get to prevail. And the way that we have structured our schools and schooling systems in terms of how we have centered white, middle class, status quo, able-bodied, heteronormative, all of those things, what this does is that decenters it. And it really invites a process of reflection, responsibility, analysis, awareness, and ultimately action. And Paulo Freire is one of the, educational theorists that a lot of folks in this kind of field refer to, because he talked about this banking theory. Education was always set up in a way where young people and children come to you as empty vessels, and it's the teacher's job, this power dynamic, to just dump the information in them, and their value as a student, their performance as a student is predicated on their ability to regurgitate that information. And that's really, I think, what the standards try to get at, is to create the environment and to encourage the dispositions, as well as the discomfort of these types of activities and exercises, if we truly want to have an educated, society.
Looking at how these standards are really putting children first. Jason, you had mentioned how it's not just about BIPOC students. White students are a part of this as well. And on this podcast, we try to really focus on Puerto Rican stories, if not the wider BIPOC community. So just curious to hear from you. And again, I don't want to disregard the white students, but just focusing on Puerto Rican students, the wider BIPOC student population. What would these standards mean for schools that service these students?
Yeah, a hell of a lot, I guess, is the answer, right? Like I was a brown student growing up in public schools, and a lot of what I wrote about was just kind of from that experience. And a thing that I don't want to be lost is that this is about achievement. This isn't about like just Black and brown kids feeling better about themselves. That's not the goal, though. That shouldn't be a problem too, right? Like if that was the goal, that's a noble goal, but it's actually about achievement. It's actually researched understanding of what school needs to be to allow Black and brown students, to that Puerto Rican kid growing up in CPS, to achieve more. Because when he goes to school, he feels whole. When he goes to school, he feels seen. This like the idea of like Maslow's needs, like what needs to be true for you as a human before you can even access learning. That's what being culturally responsive is all about. It's not just this like feel good story. How do we make this nice Disney movie where a class of brown kids feels really celebrated as a class of brown kids? No, it's about achievement. It's about closing the gap and ensuring that school is designed with all students in mind. And so you got me going, because the misconception is, again, that it's just a political story, that it's just something to transfer our ideologies onto children. And it is not that. Again, it is about learning and achievement. And I promise you from experience, because I felt school was aimless, purposeless, didn't speak to me, I was not ready to achieve. And it had nothing to do with my mom, who would whip me if I didn't focus on school, who instilled in me a passion for learning. It had nothing to do with the strength of my teachers. Well, it had something to do with that, but it had nothing to do about my own ability. It was entirely about what I viewed school to be, and that the disconnect between, like, as a kid, not having the words for it, but knowing this is not for me. That's a problem. And that's essentially the problem that these standards are trying to rectify, that we are just a little bit more deliberate about the type of school experience that we're presenting, primarily to Black and Brown students.
State Senator, same question to you. What do these standards mean for schools that service Puerto Rican students and the wider BIPOC student population?
Yeah, I think, Jason said it so well. It's about being seen. If you go to just the basic principles of education, children, young people, adults learn in the context of relationships. If you don't have a relationship, learning is not going to take place. And so what these standards attempt to do is to really facilitate a process to have a relationship, to then be able to co-create knowledge, explore the world, analyze the world, and not have to basically subtract your identity, your language, anything that makes you you in order to succeed in the academic space. It's also really to reconcile past harm, because in many ways, schools have operated as institutions that have harmed children and young people, and in some cases, families and educators. And so it's really about how do we restore that harm so that we can facilitate an educational process and also set up the environment so that learning can ultimately happen.
Shifting gears a little bit here, State Senator, just curious to hear from you. What would you say to a critic that is talking to you about these standards and says, you know what, these standards are just filled with left-leaning ideology. It's just the progressive wing of the state trying to push partisan politics in schools. What would you say to someone that brings up that criticism to you?
I think I would kind of go back to what I was just saying about, fundamentally, and also I think Jason spoke to this well too, about Maslow's hierarchy. You need some essential needs met in order to create the conditions and circumstances for learning. And when we have a system that has been constructed in a way to only see and validate some students at the expense of others, then we are not fulfilling our promise of public education, because it is only benefiting a small group of individuals, and it can carry a lasting harm through life. I mean, how many people do you know reflect on their times back at school and how painful it was for a variety of reasons? But in some of those reasons, really being anchored in that they did not have meaningful relationships with adults. They did not get their lived experience validated in the content that they were looking at. They were never seen as valued, or that their background, their history, their people have contributed anything to this society, or that if they did, it was always in a position of a lower end of the hierarchy to be exploited and all of that. So I think it's really about how do we, this is not about politics, how do we set up schooling? How do we set up education where it's really anchored in humanity and anchored in our shared responsibility, our intersectionality, our interdependence, and our ability to ultimately lift everyone up, not just those that can meet the the narrow focus of what schools have historically been.
Jason, this next one's for you. There have been critics that have pointed out that these standards are essentially requirements that are imposing an ideological litmus test on educators, making any teacher who does not espouse certain views unwelcome in Illinois schools. That's actually a quote from one of these critics. And it's my understanding that there's a teacher shortage in Illinois. According to the Illinois State Board of Education, their recent data shows that there's nearly 4,500 unfilled positions in school districts across the state as of 2021. So my question to you is, I mean, do you think that adding these standards to the training teachers are receiving will drive more people away from the profession?
I think I can confidently say it will drive more people towards the profession, and I'll get to that in a second. But the first thing I want to acknowledge, for just thinking about that quote, I remember it, but thinking about that concept, whose views will be welcome. I encourage people to dive into the document, to dive into the standards, and actually like track for yourself. What are the views or the orientations or the mindsets I would need to have to be in alignment with this document? And I think you'll find out that these views are things that every parent, white, black, brown, or blue, would want their teacher to have of their children. So the idea that, Cristina, you said it perfectly, but like the idea that my student isn't an empty vessel and comes in with value, that's a view, yes, we want our teachers to feel. The idea that my students are capable, the idea that my students, regardless of what I've been socialized to believe about the color of their skin, that they're capable of rigorous learning. That is a view that this document, it tries to impose on teachers. And I don't think that's a view we would not want of all teachers, if that makes sense. So I encourage people to actually go through and track, like, anything you read here, what's the view or this, what's the belief I would need to have to be an excellent educator? Because I'm confident you will find that any parent you talk to would want you to have that view, that belief. And so your question around like, how does this intersect with the teacher shortage? You know, we have a teacher shortage, and then you look at our numbers for BIPOC educators. Now that's a triple shortage. We are a small minority in this profession, and we're still a state, or we were until recently, a state without culturally responsive teaching standards. How could I encourage another brown person, another Puerto Rican, to enter the profession when the profession isn't even prioritizing the things that they care about? And so I actually believe that this is a pathway to pulling more teachers in, more teachers who look like and understand the experience of our students, because our students are predominantly Black and brown in the public school system. It will draw more educators in, and potentially the exact educators we've been alienating because school has not been designed for them. So I understand it. You know, I do. I understand the fear. But you have to see the opportunity here to actually pull more teachers in who are not really willing to explore the idea of joining this profession until it gets itself right. And part of getting itself right is ensuring that it is a culturally responsive profession. So I again, I understand the fears, but I actually believe the counter effect will happen. Now, granted, if there's a teacher out there who is not in it for the right reasons, doesn't believe that Black students are capable, does have an inherent bias that they're unwilling to check about Puerto Rican, Latino students, then yeah, maybe they don't belong in the profession. And finally, we're making a stake there. But that's such a minority of the people who want to enter this work. A majority of people who want to enter this work want to do something beautiful and wonderful for Black and brown students, for all students throughout the state. So I have trouble believing we'd lose a lot of people given what's in this document.
And if I can just add, I'd like to really dispel this myth about the framing of teacher shortage. there's a great article that uses like this metaphor, and speaks to, just because you can't buy a Ferrari for 98 cents doesn't mean that there's a Ferrari shortage. And what that seeks to kind of explain is that the profession over time has really just been such a it's become more and more rigid. There have been more and more things put on teachers and on their shoulders, accountability measures, quality measures. And it's not to say that those things are bad, but when you impose those without providing the appropriate support, without providing the appropriate resources and funding to be able to do that work with fidelity, you're then setting teachers up for failure. You're setting up a system of exploitation instead of it really being a system that is meant to achieve the outcomes that quality standards are set out to achieve, that accountability measures are set out to monitor. And so I think it's really important to call that out. And I don't blame, the many that have left because of the conditions, the circumstances, because they were not set up to be successful and ultimately achieve what they originally wanted to do by entering the profession. And that is accompanying children and young people on their journey for self-actualization.
I love that Ferrari analogy. You take the deep dive in what some of these teachers are expected to do, everything from the level of education they're expected to have, and the continued education they need to have in order to make somewhat of a decent living wage, on top of the class load, the multiple hats that they're expected to have, the shortages in budget, so they can't even provide the proper supplies to teach their students adequately. We actually had Alderwoman Rosana Rodriguez Sanchez on the show before, and she was talking about when she was teaching there in Puerto Rico, and there was essentially legislation that was closing schools and consolidating classrooms, and she went from having low double digits, like between 10, 20 students, to I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it was a crazy high number. And at that point, you're just asking teachers to be babysitters. And are students really getting the education that they deserve in the way our education system is currently structured? So you want this profession of being a teacher to be as attractive as possible. And a lot of times, especially what we're seeing, I'm in public relations for people that don't know listening on the show. And we will always do these brand studies to see what people really value and why someone would want to, one, support an organization or work for an organization. And one of the biggest things is, does this organization, if I'm going to give my money to it or my time, talent, and talent to it, does this organization adequately reflect my values? Am I going to be fulfilled working in this profession or for this person or for this company? And our education system is no different. If we have to instill the right policy in order to attract the right candidates that are going to give our students the education that they deserve. And then these standards are just one hurdle in the plethora of things that need to be addressed in our education system, not just here in Illinois, but around the country. This is for both of you. What do you say to critics who question why these standards around race, gender identity, the role of power, privilege, and student advocacy? So what would you say to critics who question these standards, including all of that, and why they should be implemented when Illinois students are failing to achieve different competencies in things like reading and math that are already being exacerbated by the pandemic? Is that just a mirage that critics are putting in front of people to kind of distract them from the larger issue, or is it too much for teachers to handle?
I think there are two facets to it, and the first is the premise posits that school isn't already a cultural and racial experience, because it is. It's just the matter of how deliberate we are about that racial experience. Black boys, for example, are overrepresented in both behavioral referrals and in special education. A race line is the primary predictor of success in so many different aspects of our system, and so school's already racial. It's just not in the way that we want it to be, that in a way that makes it deliberate, in a way that makes it affirming. And so this idea of like, why are we injecting this thing that has no place in school? It's already there. It's just the extent to which it is producing greater student achievement or actually more dropouts or behavior issues or whatever, right? So that's kind of my first problem, I guess, is just with the premise. It kind of misses a fundamental understanding of school as a system, and as a system of white dominance. But so there's that piece. And then the second piece, I go back to kind of what we talked about a little bit earlier. How can we do this and uphold like learning standards? We're treating them as mutually exclusive. And that ain't the case. Again, this is about one in service of the other. This is not to make school a feel-good environment, though, again, that should not be a problem. That should not be radical. It is about achievement. It is about ensuring that students can, regardless of race, background, income, can achieve at the same clip. And so, again, I have a problem with the premise. It's distinguishing the two. We can't do them both. Actually, I'm telling you, research is showing you need one to properly do the other. You need attention to equity, race, bias, and understanding of the way that plays out in school before you can ever hope to ensure that Black and brown students are meeting the standards at the same rate as their white, more affluent peers.
Putting myself into the shoes of someone that is an adult, grown adult in the professional world, we're learning that a lot of companies, a lot of employees are demanding more from the companies that they work for in order to really feel fulfilled in their work. And the data shows that productivity does increase. Like people are happier at their jobs when they, have access to free food. They have access to a nap room, good benefits. Again, this isn't like, this is not an exact comparison, but just thinking about like, if we as adults, if the trend is we need more from our companies than just to be put in front of a screen or to be put at a desk and just get to work, there are so many layers to this. So if we're feeling this need as adults, imagine our children, what they're going through as they're continuing to develop and not only coming into their own identity, but the developments of their mind. State Senator, same question to you. Are these standards too much for teachers to handle?
No, I mean, I think at least in my experience, when I was serving on the state board and I was deliberate about engaging with educators on a regular basis, and then of course, all of my professional experience, I think teachers crave this type of support, and that it's institutional, it's structural, because too often when you did have educators that decided to kind of buck the system and, do their own thing, in many ways, they would sometimes be rendered as deviant. They would get or subversive or, get disciplined. And so this actually, I think, offers greater protection. As a matter of fact, I'm reminded of a set of educators who were working in rural Illinois, and both white and predominantly white institutions. But they themselves really wanted to do the very important work of what the standards were trying to get at, and did not have the support of administration, began to feel even more marginalized, began to feel like failures, and that they were doing a disservice for the young people and children that they were teaching. and started to feel like they needed to get out of the system. So I think, because I think Jason had said before, it's the converse. I think it'll invite people in because they can then see themselves in the process. They can then see that to be an educator is not to harm children anymore or to make them conform to a particular thought process and structure and way of being. Because the other piece that I think is incredibly important, and it is going to be some work on the adults, is that because we are centering in children and young people, that they come to us full and whole and with tons of assets, and they should have agency and they should have voice and be able to be a part of decision-making processes. It starts to chip away at what schools also reinforce, and that is adultism, which is, a frame and a thinking that adults are always right and that adults should always be in control. And it's very hierarchical and very much about dominance and domestication, instead of adults being partners in the process of self-determination, self-actualization, self-realization, being accompanying this young person or this child on their human journey. And so I really think that it's not, but it is going to require some deep self reflection and kind of also releasing, because in so many ways we've been socialized to accept the way that it has been as typical and as normal. And especially if we've been able to be successful and we say, oh, we stuck it out and we did it. Well, why do we have to live with that kind of trauma and stress? Why should we be proud of that? How about we set humans up for their best possible life from the beginning? Like, I want to be a part of that.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you said that. You're going to get me heated here because I have a lot of student loan debt. And that's like,
don't we all?
I know, right? Jeez. But that's a common thing that comes up in a lot of these debates. Just using student loan debt as an example, when we hear about organizations, politicians pushing for forgiving student debt, and you'll look in the comment sections on social media, people will say, well, I had to work 2 jobs and did this, that, and the other in order to pay off my student debt. Everybody else should. Well, who says that's the standard? Why in the heck would you want the generation that comes after you to experience the same hardships as you yourself did? How are you building a better society and a better life for the people that come after us? So I never understand people that bring that counter argument to these types of debates. It just feels like, well, what are you really arguing at this point? Let's keep the status quo. Doesn't make sense to me. We took the deep dive. We're pretty deep into our conversation here, so I do want to be respectful of both of your times because I know you both got kids and y'all got families. I do not have a kid. I have a dog though, so it's not close to what y'all experience. But I can hear scratching at the door here in the back.
I can hear my toddler scratching at the door, so that just puts things into context for you.
They'll be coming soon.
Yeah.
Okay, you two, we have some rapid fire listener questions. I keep bringing this one along because I really like it. Let's start with you, Jason. What is your favorite Puerto Rican restaurant to eat at in Chicago?
You literally started with the hardest question. Man. I don't know if y'all feel this way, but I feel like different Puerto Rican restaurants do that one thing really well. You know what I mean? Like Ponce's Acapurias. Like, I just have yet to see someone beat them. But I'm gonna need like La Plena's lechon. So it's, you know what I mean? Like, it's really hard for me to choose because literally, I kid you not, I have once gone to multiple restaurants to build my dinner. I promise you, is what I had way too much time. It was pre-toddler, but I've done that. I've been about that life. But right now, I think, if I had to choose, me and my wife right now, we're just regulars at Café Colau on in the Paseo, little kind of breakfast cafe joint. Wonderful staff, really good food. There's nothing like eating a pork sandwich for breakfast, so that's gonna have to be my choice.
Right on. They have a really good iced café con leche too, which are hard to find. I haven't found many places that make an iced café con leche. Okay, Cristina, favorite Puerto Rican restaurant you like to eat at in Chicago?
I love La Plena. I mean,
Yes.
La Plena is fire. That's your like abuela in the back right there.
Mm-hmm.
Cooking it up fresh. I mean, right on the spot. They have an amazing like verdura con bacalao. I'm a pescatarian, so like I do have a little bit of a limitation with our cuisine, but I mean, if we were on the island, man, I have so many options because you got amazing mariscos everywhere. But I love La Plena, especially too because I love how the kitchen's open and you can like see them cooking right there. It's just awesome. And then also the walls are like a great, journey, educational journey, like when my kids are there, we like look at all the Taino symbols and they've got the map and it's just the whole experience is awesome. And, I think I've got to shout out Nelly's, of course, for the Avena de Coco, which is like fire to the max. There's something, I mean, there's got to be some crack in there, I swear.
Absolutely. PCP, one of those.
I've tried to recreate that Avena de Coco and I fail every time.
Not enough crack.
It's impossible.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it is impossible. And I've tried to get that recipe out of them, like in sneaky ways, and they have it locked down.
That's the true goal of this podcast, right? Like you're going to get big enough where finally they'll give you this recipe.
Yeah, we might do an investigative report, like a podcast series. Go, yeah. What is behind the Avena de Coco at Nelly's?
It'd be like a cook-off. Like if we all tried to create it and see who can get to the closest.
I love that idea, actually. Okay, I'm writing that one down too. While we're on the topic of food, Jason, this next rapid fire question is for you. If you had the option to choose one Puerto Rican dish to introduce your son to, what would it be?
Well, what's funny is that's probably the first thing I thought about when I knew I was going to be a father. So like that was it. I was like, not diapers, not,
priorities.
Yeah. It was priorities. It was Puerto Rican food. It's gotta be arroz con habichuela or arroz con gandules, like just the iconic thing, the thing that screams Puerto Rico, because he's biracial, and I really want him to appreciate and value his culture. And one of those things is kind of go into the basics. So definitely some rice and beans, throw some lechon in there, and it's game time.
Cristina, this next question is for you. This isn't the question, but just almost like a little precursor. When is your state senator seat up for re-election?
In 2022.
Okay. What are your future plans in 2022?
I'm going to run.
Okay.
Let's do it.
All right. Okay. Good to hear. Okay, cool. That was a little quick one. Jason, got another question for you here. Recently, you were elected to local school council. If you could sum up your experience running for that seat in 5 words, what would those 5 words be?
Powerful, home, community, odd / virtual, and humble. That's what it was all about for me.
Cristina, you have to go to Springfield still, right? Even during the pandemic to cast votes, correct?
Well, we have our rules now allow us to do everything remote.
Okay.
We just passed some rules in the lame duck session to allow for virtual or remote voting. So I was down there in January, though, for the lame duck session. And then so far we haven't had to go back, but there is some talk about it is on the schedule. We just haven't received any notice if it's going to get canceled again for March. The first week of March, we're supposed to be back.
And did you fly or drive to Springfield?
I drove. I have the only time I flew to Springfield was actually last year this time, because I was literally coming from Puerto Rico to do the hurricane work. came back to sleep overnight in Chicago, and got up on a plane to go to Springfield to be at the State Board of Education meeting and fly back. Because I was like, I am not going to, because I think I did a red eye flight, from Puerto Rico. And so I was like, there's no way I'm going to get on the road and drive for 3 hours in February.
Yeah, no, that's rough. When you were traveling to Springfield, what was on your playlist for those 3 hours? What music were you listening to?
Man, I wish I had a playlist. I was on the phone the whole time. That you got to put in your calls.
Wow.
I was talking so much that my throat was so dry and like hoarse pretty much, because it was like 3 hours straight. There's one thing that you notice in this job. I mean, you really, you try to maximize every single minute. Mm-hmm. And, when you have 3 hours of that time, it's great to do calls that you can take your time with and not have to, be so transactional or whatever. So the last time I was on the phone all the way there, all the way back, just doing the thing.
Okay. I'm not gonna lie. I was hoping that you'd say like, I'm blasting the new Bad Bunny album or dancing in my seat to some Mark Anthony. But no, I mean, what you were doing was way more important than listening to Spotify. So.
Bad Bunny's in the background.
Yeah. Next time around, I'm going to throw on Maluma, because I've been totally in the latest album, everything. But, every once in a while, I get to throw in my jams.
Last question for you all. This is a segment that we really don't have a name for, but we ask all of our guests this to round out the show. What is one thing or things that you are most obsessed with? Now, this could be related to Puerto Rican culture, not related. What are some things you are both obsessed with? Jason, let's start with you.
It's going to be a little bit of a cop-out, but it's hard not to say my son, who I brought up now, just like joining the Moose Local School Council, which is will be his neighborhood school, seeing him develop and as he tries to understand his like biracial identity. Like, I'm obsessed with him because he's in this phase where like Papi is funny and fun. I'm not just like second fiddle to mom no more. Like, I actually got a role to play. So I'm obsessed with him because he's been a blast. So a little bit of a cop out, but that's my Puerto Rican and father piece.
That's everything.
Yeah, that's good. Not a cop out at all. Cristina, what about you?
You know what?
Now do you have to say it's your kids? Like,
I know it's gonna be weird that I set you up.
That's right.
Besides your kids, I'll give you the idea. Besides your kids, what are you obsessed with?
Besides my husband, because he's gonna also feel like left out and all that. And I've been with the man for almost 25 years, so obviously,
oh my goodness,
come on. I would have to say, I've been lately obsessed with not getting COVID. It's real in the sense, like, it's just, I think what I want to, really emphasize what's just been so shocking to me is how lax people have gotten about it. And I'm just always super duper paranoid and worried, particularly because we have some, kind of extenuating circumstances in my household. And, knowing what's happening, particularly in communities of color with infection and mortality and all of that. So like, for me, it's about masking up all the time. It's about washing my hands. It's about, like a couple weeks ago, my eye started tearing, my nose started dripping. And you best believe I was in that drive-through trying to get even though I hadn't been anywhere, right? I was like, yeah. I don't know, maybe when I went, I was at a doctor's appointment and I was like, maybe there. So I feel like I've been incredibly heightenedly aware of, a lot of the basics in public health about, making sure that you're just constantly, safeguarding. But that's obviously not a fun thing to be obsessed with.
But very real.
But very, very, very real, indeed.
Curious to hear from you both. if people listening want to keep up with both of you, how can they do that? Social media, website, give us all the things. How can people keep up with you both?
So I've got, I'm on all the social channels. Facebook, you can look up Senator Cristina Pacione-Zayas, Twitter as well. And I need to update my Insta account to make sure that I've got that avenue going as well. I just think basically those places, of course, LinkedIn, it just kind of depends on, what's your preferred social platform.
Similarly, like depending on kind of what type of connection you're looking for, Instagram is my current social. I was late to it. I'm a year in, but it's definitely the place where I'm just talking Puerto Rican culture, fatherhood, living in Humboldt Park. So if that interests you, definitely j.humboldt. And LinkedIn. I also just recently, I know, don't judge me, but just started to update that with some encouragement of really powerful people of color in my life. So if you're just kind of want to better understand my professional trajectory and kind of some of the things I've been up to or am a part of, you can find me on there. Jason Dones.
Awesome. Illinois State Senator Cristina Pacione-Zayas, Jason Dones, the Managing Director of Core Member Leadership for Teach for America. Thank you both so much for being on the Paseo podcast today.
Thank you, as always, for being you and for creating the platform for Puerto Rican voices.
Yeah, same. Really, really just proud of you, proud of the space, and happy to have spent the time with you both. Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks, y'all.